The world outside the cockpit was a torrent of green and red traces, a furious storm of light clawing at the skin of the C-130 Hercules. Every impact felt personal, a hammer blow that shuddered through the fuselage and up Captain Eva Rostova's spine. Alarms shrieked in a dozen different tones, a symphony of imminent disaster. Beside her, her co-pilot, a young lieutenant named Miller, was chanting a prayer under his breath, his knuckles white on the yoke. Why was a 4-engine cargo plane, a beast of burden nicknamed the Fat Albert, flying this deep into a hornet's nest? That was the question screaming through the chaos, a question nobody on the ground had time to ask. They were too busy trying not to die. Through the distorted crackle of the radio, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne's voice was stripped of its usual condescending calm. Valkyrie, we are pinned. I say again, we are taking effective fire from all sides. The primary exfil is a bust. We need a way out, now. His call sign for her, Valkyrie, was a fresh wound. He'd given it to her in the briefing room just 6 hours ago, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a joke, a reference to her Russian last name and her gender, a pretty name for a taxi driver. In the world of SEALs, the pilots who flew the big planes were just that, a bus service. Reliable, necessary, but ultimately background characters. He had made it clear he didn't trust the most important mission of his career to a woman whose father had left the Air Force in disgrace. Eva ignored the sting of the memory. She ignored Miller's panicked breathing and the angry red lights on her control panel. Her focus was narrowed to the glowing topographical map on her screen and the sliver of night sky visible between the streams of enemy fire. They were in a box canyon, a natural kill zone the SEALs had been lured into. The intelligence had been wrong. The high-value target, a shadowy arms dealer known only as the Ghost, hadn't been cornered. He had set a trap. Now, SEAL Team 3, the legendary Punishers, were the ones on the ropes, their planned helicopter extraction shot out of the sky. All they had left was her, the taxi driver, the woman whose own command seemed to be waiting for her to fail, the daughter of a pilot who had once been a legend and was now a cautionary tale. The story had started, as it so often did, in a sterile, windowless briefing room at Bagram Airfield. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. Maps and satellite images covered the walls. Lieutenant Commander Thorne stood at the head of the table, a man carved from granite and impatience. He moved with the coiled energy of a predator, his eyes sweeping over his team with fierce pride, and over Eva with something bordering on disdain. He was a legend in the teams, a man who had fought in every dust-blown corner of the world. And he did not like surprises. Eva, a last-minute replacement for a pilot on medical leave, was a very big surprise. Your bird is a C-130J, Captain Rostova, he'd asked, though he already knew the answer. The question was a test, the tone an accusation. That's correct. Commander, Eva had replied, her voice even. She refused to be intimidated. She dealt with men like Thorne her entire life. Men who saw her gender first, her rank second, and her skill never. We need precision, Captain. Not a bus drop, he'd continued, addressing the room more than her. The insertion is on a dime, high altitude, low opening. You get us on the X, no exceptions. From there, we handle it. Your job is to fly straight and level, get out, and wait for our call. When we call for exfil, you come in fast and you get us out clean. No heroics. No improvisation. Am I clear? The implication was clear. She was a delivery service, and he expected her to be little more than an autopilot. The word improvisation hung in the air, aimed directly at her. Everyone in the special operations community knew the story of Colonel Rostova, her father, a brilliant pilot who, according to the official report, had improvised a maneuver during a mission years ago, a maneuver that had saved his aircraft but allowed a key enemy target to escape. He was hailed as a coward in some circles, a reckless hothead in others. He was honorably discharged, but the stink of failure had followed him, and now, it seemed, it followed her. One of the younger SEALs had snickered. Don't worry, sir. What's the worst that can happen? She gets a flat tire. Thorne hadn't silenced him. He'd let the remark hang in the air, a small, sharp barb meant to put her in her place. It was in that moment he had looked at her. Flight suit, at the name Rostova stitched over her heart, and dubbed her Valkyrie. A beautiful, mythical creature who decided who lived and who died. To him, she was just a ferryman, and he was making it clear he didn't want his fate in her hands. Now, hours later, fate was laughing at them all. Thorne's carefully laid plans were in ashes, his men were trapped, and their only hope was the pilot he had dismissed. On the ground, the situation was deteriorating by the second. The Ghost's fighters were well-trained and heavily armed. They had RPGs, heavy machine guns, and the high ground. The SEALs, masters of offense, were now caught in a desperate defense, returning fire from behind the rocky outcrops that provided their only cover. They were outnumbered 3-1, and their ammunition was running low. Valkyrie, what is your status? Thorne's voice crackled again, the desperation more pronounced. We cannot hold this position for long. Eva scanned her instruments. The right inboard engine was overheating. The fuselage was peppered with holes. The pressure warnings were screaming at her. Landing was completely out of the question. The canyon floor was a graveyard of jagged rocks and uneven terrain. Attempting a landing would mean tearing the plane to pieces and killing everyone aboard. Any other pilot would have followed protocol, reported the situation as impossible, and retreated to a safe distance to call for air support that was 30 minutes away. 30 minutes the SEALs didn't have. Her mind raced, sifting through years of training, through emergency procedures, through the stories her father used to tell her. He would sit with her for hours, using model airplanes to illustrate concepts. Not found in any official flight manual. They teach you how to fly the plane, he'd say, his voice a low rumble. They don't teach you how to think the plane. The book gives you answers. A real pilot finds solutions. He had found a solution that day, the one that ended his career. He saved his crew, but at the cost of the mission. The brass called it cowardice. He called it his duty. A new piece of intel had come in mid-flight, a small detail that now seemed like a prophecy. The Ghost's forces had acquired a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile system, the kind that was notoriously difficult to jam. Thorne's reaction over the comms had been laced with his usual skepticism. Just stick to the flight plan, Captain. Keep your altitude. Don't draw any attention. We don't need any complications. The unspoken words were deafening. Don't be like your father. Don't screw this up now. Complication was all they had. The textbook was useless here. Protocol was a death sentence. Thorne's orders, fly straight, wait for the call, were a ghost's whisper from a mission that no longer existed. There was only the canyon, the fire, and the dying men on the ground. She saw a solution, a ghost of an idea from one of her father's lessons. It was insane. It was dangerous. It wasn't in any book. It was a gamble that would either save them all or get them all killed. Her flight engineer's voice cut through her thoughts, high and tight with panic. We've got multiple system failures. The hydraulics are losing pressure. We have to gain altitude and get out of the hot zone. That's an order from Flight Command. He was right. By the book, he was absolutely right. But Eva wasn't. Looking at the book. She was looking at the faces of the men on the ground in her mind's eye, men who had mocked her, men who had doubted her, but who were now trusting her with their last breath. She thought of Thorne, the arrogant commander. His voice now just the raw plea of a man trying to bring his brothers home. She thought of her father, and the choice he had made, with a resolve that settled over her like a shroud. She made her decision. She would not make her father's choice. She would not save the plane at the cost of the mission. She would risk the plane to save the men. She pushed the 4 throttles forward to their maximum, the engine screaming in protest. The big plane, already wounded, shuddered and accelerated, not up and away from the danger, but deeper into it. What are you doing? Miller yelled, his eyes wide with terror. We are going deeper into the canyon. On the radio, Thorne's voice was a roar of disbelief. Valkyrie, what is your intention? Pull up. I repeat, pull up. Disengage and abort. Her flight engineer screamed from the back. We can't. The canyon walls are too narrow. It's a suicide run. Eva keyed her microphone, her voice a stark contrast to the chaos around her. Calm, measured, and absolute. Negative. Thorne. Landing is not an option. She looked at the targeting display, at the cluster of enemy positions spitting fire at the trap SEALs. But I have another idea. The nose of the C-130 dipped, and the massive aircraft began to descend, plunging directly toward the heart of the enemy fire, a metal leviathan charging into the depths of hell. The SEALs on the ground looked up, their faces a mixture of horror and awe, watching as the plane they thought was their ride home instead flew straight for the enemy, seemingly intent on a final, glorious, and utterly insane act of self-destruction. The C-130 screamed as a dove. The airframe groaned under stresses it was never designed to withstand, a sound like tearing metal that vibrated through the floor plates and into the soles of Eva's boots. Red warning lights flashed across the console, each one a separate, urgent death knell. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Engine fire warning on number 3. Airspeed critical. Outside, the traces were no longer a storm. They were a solid wall of light, and she was flying straight into it. Her co-pilot, Miller, was wrestling with his own yoke, instinctively trying to pull the plane up. "Captain, you're going to kill us all," he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Let go of the controls, Lieutenant." Eva commanded, her voice sharp as glass. She didn't have the strength to fight him and the dying aircraft at the same time. He stared at her for a split second, his eyes wide with disbelief, then his hands fell away. Over the radio, Thorne was apoplectic. "Valkyrie, I am ordering you to pull up. Abort. Abort. You are flying into a kill box." Eva ignored him. Her eyes were locked on the terrain ahead, her hands and feet moving in a fluid, practiced dance on the controls. She wasn't aiming for the enemy. She wasn't aiming for the SEALs. She was aiming for the space between them. The canyon floor was sand and loose rock, baked dry by a relentless sun. It was a pilot's nightmare but a tactician's opportunity. The idea had come to her in a flash, a memory of her father in their backyard, holding a small wooden glider. "Remember, Evie," he'd said, launching it into a pile of autumn leaves, which scattered in its wake. "Sometimes the most powerful thing a plane has isn't its weapons, but its wind." She leveled out at just 50 feet above the canyon floor, an altitude so dangerously low that the plane's shadow engulfed the battlefield. The 4 massive turboprops, each one a spinning vortex of power, began to do their work. The prop wash, a hurricane of focused air, hit the sandy ground and erupted. A colossal wall of dust, rock, and debris was kicked into the air, a churning, opaque cloud that rose 100 feet in seconds. It was a brownout, but not for landing. It was a smokescreen, a man-made sandstorm created by a 70-ton aircraft. The effect was instantaneous. The enemy fire became sporadic, then ceased altogether as their line of sight vanished. They were firing blind into a swirling vortex of grit and sand. For the SEALs, it was a miracle. One moment they were facing certain death, the next they were shrouded in a protective cloak of dust. Thorne, his initial rage turning to stunned comprehension, was the first to react. "Move. Move now. Fall back to Rally Point Bravo. Go." The SEALs didn't hesitate. They broke contact, melting back into the dust cloud, using the precious seconds Eva had bought them to retreat to a more defensible position further up the canyon. The sound of the C-130's engines was their North Star, a roaring beacon in the blinding chaos. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity, a move no enemy commander could have ever anticipated because it simply wasn't supposed to be possible. But the price was steep. Inside the cockpit, a heavy machine gun round ripped through the unarmored fuselage below the side window. It didn't explode. It tumbled, punching through a conduit of hydraulic lines before ricocheting off the cockpit bulkhead. The plane shuddered violently. A hot, stinging spray of hydraulic fluid filled the air. Miller cried out, clutching his arm where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his flight suit. The right side of the cockpit went dark as multiple systems shorted out. The beautiful, terrible symphony of alarms grew louder. "Miller, you hit?" Eva asked, her eyes never leaving the view screen. I'm okay," he stammered, his voice shaky. "Just my arm. The primary hydraulics are gone. We are on backups, and they're leaking." They were flying a crippled bird, half blind, bleeding fluid, and still deep inside a canyon, teeming with enemies who were now recovering from the initial shock. The ghost was smart. He wasn't going to be fooled for long. As if on cue, a new sound joined the cacophony, the dull thump-thump-thump of heavy mortars. The enemy was adapting, lobbing shells blindly into the dust cloud, hoping to get lucky. They were bracketing the sound of the engines. "Thorne, talk to me," Eva transmitted, her voice tight. "Where is Bravo?" "North side of the canyon, about a half-mile up. It's a small plateau, maybe 200 feet long. Not much, but it's higher ground." His tone had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. Valkyrie, that was one hell of a move. But you need to get out of here. We can hold out for the QRF. Negative, Commander, Eva replied, gritting her teeth as she fought the controls. The damaged plane wanted to roll over and die. The QRF is 30 minutes out. You don't have 30 minutes. Get to that plateau. I'm coming to get you. A heavy silence fell over the comms. The idea was absurd. Landing a C-130 required a runway, a long, flat, stable surface. A 200-foot-long rocky plateau wasn't a runway. It was a postage stamp on the side of a mountain. It was an impossible extraction. As they limped through the air, the dust cloud behind them beginning to settle, they heard a new voice over the radio. It was intercepted, a clear, cold voice speaking in the local dialect. It was the ghost. He was on the radio directing his men, his tone mocking. He was promising them a bonus for every American head they brought him. He was enjoying the hunt. He thought he had them trapped, the wounded plane and the cornered soldiers. Eva looked at the fuel gauge. It was dropping far faster than it should be, the damaged engine burning it away. She looked at the hydraulic pressure, a needle slowly bleeding toward zero. She looked at Miller, who was trying to tie a makeshift tourniquet around his arm with one hand. They were alone, wounded, and running out of time and options. There was a moment of profound silence in the cockpit, the roar of the engines a constant, but the immediate chaos had subsided into a tense, grim waiting game. She knew in that moment that this flight might be her last. She thought of her home. The quiet street she grew up on, the smell of her mother's cooking, the weight of her father's disappointment. You know, in moments like that, you think of the strangest things. Not just the big picture, but the small details of the life you're fighting for. The place you call home. By the way, which city are you watching this story from? Drop your city's name in the comments. Who knows, maybe the spirit of your city is a bit like Eva's, tough and unwilling to back down. It's always amazing to see where these stories reach. Back in the cockpit, Eva's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Fuel consumption versus distance. Airspeed versus lift with the damaged hydraulics. She looked at the plateau on the map. Again, Thorne was right. Landing was impossible. But who said anything about landing? Her father's voice echoed in her memory again. Another lesson from a lifetime ago. He was talking about carrier landings, the controlled crashes of the Navy. The best pilots, he'd said, don't just use the rules. They understand the principles behind the rules. Lift, drag, thrust, weight. That's it. Everything else is just technique. And a new technique, a terrifying, desperate one, began to form in her mind. It was a theoretical maneuver, something whispered about in special operations wings but almost never attempted. It lived in the appendix of a classified manual, a footnote, on unconventional warfare. It was called a touch-and-go extraction. It wasn't about landing. It was about grazing. Loadmaster, you there? Eva called over the intercom. Here, Captain, came the reply from the NCO in charge of the cargo bay. Prepare for an extraction. Open the ramp on my command. We are not stopping. There was a pause. The loadmaster, a seasoned master sergeant who had seen everything, sounded utterly baffled. Say again? Did you say we are not stopping? That's affirmative, Sergeant. Tell the SEALs to be ready to run. And I mean run. Captain, the sergeant replied, his voice strained with disbelief. A touch-and-go extraction. That's not a real thing. It's a concept. We are not trained for it. The plane isn't configured for it. Before Eva could respond, a new threat bled to life. The radar warning receiver shrieked. 2 enemy fighter jets, older models but still deadly, were approaching fast. The Ghost had called in his own air support. They were out of time. The crazy idea was now the only idea. Eva looked at the radar, then at the looming cliffs of the plateau ahead. She banked the huge, wounded plane, coaxing it into a turn that felt impossibly tight, the wings seeming to brush the canyon walls. The aircraft shuddered and screamed, but it held. She lined it up with the tiny strip of rock where the SEALs were making their last stand. She keyed the intercom again, her voice cutting through the sergeant's protests like a blade. We are today, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Get ready. The C-130, trailing a thin ribbon of black smoke from its damaged engine, flew toward the plateau like a wounded hawk. On that small sliver of rock, The SEALs of Team 3 watched it come, a mix of awe and terror on their smoke-stained faces. They had just fought their way to this relative safety, and now their only way out was an aircraft that looked like it was about to fall out of the sky, aiming for a landing strip that didn't exist. Thorne watched through his rifle scope, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw the damaged landing gear, stuck in the down position. He saw the holes riddling the fuselage. He wasn't sure if he was witnessing a rescue or a final, shared grave. "Get ready to board," he yelled to his men. "On my mark. And for God's sake, don't hesitate." Inside the cockpit, Eva was fighting a war on two fronts. One against the enemy fighters closing in, the other against her own aircraft. The backup hydraulics were sluggish, making the controls feel heavy and unresponsive, like trying to steer a ship in mud. She had to fly by feel, by instinct, anticipating the plane's every protest and compensating before it could turn catastrophic. Miller was calling out airspeed and altitude, his voice now steady, his earlier panic replaced by a focused professionalism born of having no other choice. "Airspeed 120 knots and falling," Miller chanted. 110. "Stall warning is going. To kick in any second, Captain." "I know," Eva said through clenched teeth. She needed to be just above stall speed, slow enough for a man to run and jump onto the ramp, but fast enough to maintain lift. It was a razor's edge, a breath of air between flying and falling. "Loadmaster, drop the ramp. Now." In the cargo bay, the massive ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, opening up to the swirling air and the fast-approaching cliff face. The roar of the wind was deafening. The SEALs saw it open and tensed, their bodies coiled like springs. They were about to attempt to board a moving airplane on the edge of a cliff while under fire. Eva's hands were a blur on the controls. She cut the power to the inboard engines, keeping the outboard screaming to maintain control. The plane descended, its trajectory impossibly precise. She wasn't aiming to land. She was aiming to kiss the ground for no more than 3 seconds. The wheels of the C-130 hit the very edge of the plateau with a jarring, violent crash that sent a shockwave through the entire aircraft. It wasn't a landing, it was an impact. For a single, eternal second, the 70-ton plane was tethered to the earth, its engines roaring as it tried to tear itself free. "Go! Go! Go!" Thorne screamed. The SEALs sprinted. It was a mad dash up the steep incline of the ramp, a desperate scramble for survival. The first men dove headfirst into the cargo bay, rolling to make way for the others. Mortar rounds were landing around them now, the enemy having found their range. Chunks of rock exploded into the air. Bullets pinged off the ramp and fuselage, a deadly steel rain. Eva held the plane steady, her muscles screaming with the effort of keeping it from either stalling or lurching forward into the cliff. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Through the cargo bay camera on her console, she could see the chaos unfolding. She saw men hauling their wounded comrades aboard. She saw Thorne at the edge of the ramp, physically pulling his teammates in, refusing to board until he was the last man. Then she saw it, a young SEAL, no older than 20, frozen at the base of the ramp. His eyes were wide with the sheer terror of the moment, the noise, the bullets, the vibrating metal monster in front of him. He was paralyzed. Thorne was screaming. His name, his hand outstretched, but the kid couldn't move. Without a moment's hesitation, Eva made a micro-adjustment, a fractional nudge of the rudder pedals. The plane's left wing dipped precariously, a move that put the entire aircraft at risk of stalling out and cartwheeling into the canyon. But it shifted the plane's momentum just enough, buying them one more precious second. The ramp swayed closer to the frozen SEAL. That 1 second was all Thorne needed. He lunged, grabbing the front of the kid's body armor and hauling him backward onto the ramp with a primal roar. Just as Thorne dragged the last man inside, a blinding flash and a deafening explosion rocked the plane. An RPG had slammed into the rock just beneath the right landing gear. The impact blew the tires and mangled the struts. The plane lurched violently. "Ramp up. Everybody's on." Thorne's voice yelled over the intercom. Eva poured everything into the throttles. The engines screamed in protest, but they responded. The C-130, its gear now shattered, clawed its way back into the sky, staggering away from the cliff edge like a wounded beast. They were airborne. They were alive. As the ramp closed, sealing them into the relative safety of the fuselage, a wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Eva. She leaned back in her seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the relief was short-lived. A new alarm, angrier than all the others, began to sound. "The landing gear won't retract," Miller said, his voice grim. "The right side is completely shot. It's stuck." The mangled gear hung beneath the plane like a deadweight, a massive source of drag. It made the plane sluggish, unstable, and ravenously thirsty for fuel. Eva watched the fuel gauge plummet. They weren't just losing fuel, they were hemorrhaging it. They were a sitting duck, and the Ghost's fighters were now visible on the horizon, closing in for the kill. There was no way they could outrun them. There was no way they could make it back to Bagram. Thorne made his way to the cockpit, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. He stood behind Eva's seat, looking at the damage reports on the screen. He saw the fuel gauge. He saw the approaching enemy fighters on the radar. He looked at Eva, and for the first time, there was no mockery in his eyes, only a shared sense of doom. "We lost him," he said, his voice flat. "The Ghost is getting away. All of this, for nothing." He was a man who defined himself by mission, success, and in his mind, they had just failed. They had survived, but they had lost. Eva didn't respond. She wasn't looking at the fighters behind them. She was looking at the topographical map in front of them. Her mind was racing, connecting dots that weren't there. The Ghost was escaping. He would be in his convoy, heading for the border. He would have to take the fastest route through the mountains. And there was only one, a single, narrow pass that snaked through the highest peaks. The fighters were a distraction, meant to keep them busy while the real prize slipped away. Her eyes traced a line on the map, a path that no sane pilot would ever consider. It was a deep, winding canyon, a treacherous scar in the earth that was not charted as an official flight path for a reason. It was too narrow, too dangerous, prone to unpredictable wind shear that could tear a plane apart. But it was a shortcut, a way to get ahead of the Ghost's convoy. She looked at the fuel gauge again. They didn't have enough fuel to climb over the mountain range to intercept him at the pass. They couldn't go over. So they would have to go through. Her co-pilot, Miller, saw where she was looking. He understood instantly. "Captain, no," he whispered, his face pale. "Our wingspan is 132 feet. Some of those passages on the map are barely wider than that. The turbulence in there, it will rip the wings off." Thorne looked from the map to Eva, his eyes questioning. He thought the fight was over, that it was now just a matter of survival. But he saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not just skill, not just courage, but a cold, hard fury. A refusal to lose. Eva turned in her seat and met his gaze. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The SEALs thought it was over," she said, her words a direct challenge to his earlier statement. "It's not." She turned back to the controls and keyed the intercom, her voice ringing throughout the battered aircraft. "Get your men ready, Commander. We are going hunting." The entrance to the canyon was like the mouth of some great stone beast, and Eva flew the C-130 directly into its gullet. The moment they entered, the world outside the cockpit became a claustrophobic blur of grey rock. Sunlight vanished, replaced by a dim, oppressive twilight. The air grew violent. Turbulence grabbed the wounded plane and shook it with brutal force, slamming it up and down in bone-jarring jolts. In the back, the SEALs, hardened warriors who had faced death a dozen times, were tossed around like rag dolls, bracing themselves against the bulkheads of the darkened cargo bay. This was a different kind of terror, a feeling of complete helplessness. Their fate in the hands of the pilot they had once ridiculed. On the flight deck, Thorne had wedged himself into the space behind the pilot seats, his hands gripping a bulkhead for support. He was watching Eva fly, and what he was seeing defied belief. She wasn't just piloting the aircraft, she was fused with it. Every dip of the wing, every nudge of the rudder was a precise, calculated response to the violent air currents. Her eyes darted from the windscreen to her instruments, her expression one of intense, unwavering concentration. She was flying a 100-foot wide cargo plane through a passage that felt no wider than a city street, the wingtips mere feet from the jagged canyon walls. It was an act of pure, terrifying artistry. He saw the small, faded photograph clipped to her console, a younger Eva, smiling, standing next to a man with the same determined eyes. A pilot. Her father. Suddenly, Thorne understood. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. This wasn't about following orders or proving a point to him. This was something deeper, something personal. It was about reclaiming a legacy, about finishing a fight that had started a generation ago. Shame, an emotion Thorne rarely felt, pricked at him. His mockery, his doubt, it all seemed so small, so petty now. He had tested her, and in doing so, had revealed only his own limitations. He leaned forward, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Captain, my men have thermal optics. We can be your eyes. Tell us what you need." A new partnership was forged in that moment, born of mutual desperation, and a newfound respect. Eva would call out approaching turns, and Thorne would relay it to his team. The SEALs, peering through the few portholes, would scan the canyon walls ahead, calling out rockfalls, narrow passages, and enemy positions, setting up hasty ambushes on the cliffs above. 2 hostiles, cliffside, 10 o'clock high, one would yell over the comms, and Eva would bank the plane hard, using a rock outcropping as a shield against the incoming RPG fire. They were no longer just passengers. They were part of the crew, a single, unified team fighting their way through the mountain's heart. After what felt like an eternity, they broke through the worst of the canyon and saw it ahead, the pass. And snaking its way toward it was a convoy of a dozen vehicles. The Ghost's convoy. They had beaten him there. But their relief was immediately crushed by a new, terrible realization. The pass was a natural choke point, but it was wider than they had anticipated. It was a bottleneck, not a cork. The Ghost's vehicles could easily drive around any wreckage if they tried to shoot up the lead truck. And they had no bombs, no missiles, nothing powerful enough to cause a landslide to block it completely. Their gamble had gotten them there first, but it had left them with no way to spring the trap. The Ghost was going to slip through their fingers. Again. Eva's eyes flicked to the fuel gauge. The needle was now deep in the red. The engines were sputtering. They had maybe 5 minutes of flight left. Not enough to turn back. Not enough to climb. Not enough to do anything but die. The mission had failed. They had failed. The silence in the cockpit was thick with despair. Then Eva looked at the pass again, her pilot's mind seeing not just a road, but a runway. A final runway. A quiet, terrifying certainty settled over her. She knew what she had to do. There was only one weapon they had left that was big enough to block the pass. The plane itself. She took a deep breath and keyed the intercom, her voice calm and clear, a beacon of purpose in the face of certain death. "Thorne, get your men to the ramp. Miller, prepare for emergency landing procedures. We are putting her down. Right there." She pointed through the windscreen at the pass ahead. Miller stared at her, his face ashen. "Captain, that's not a landing. That's a crash." "I know," she said softly. Thorne's voice came over the radio, sharp and protesting. "Valkyrie, you can't. That's a one-way trip. It's suicide." Eva looked back at the photo of her father. She thought of the choice he had made, the safe choice that had saved his crew but haunted him until the day he died. He had followed orders. He had preserved the asset. And he had lived with the shame of the mission's failure forever. She would not. Her legacy would be different. "My father was grounded for making the safe choice that cost men their lives," she said, her voice resonating with a strength that silenced all argument. "He lived with that shame every day. I won't." She switched her transmission to the entire aircraft, so every SEAL and every member of her crew could hear her. "We are not a taxi service. We are the United States Air Force. We finish the fight." A beat of silence. Then, one by one, the voices came back. Her loadmaster. "Roger that, Captain. Ramp is ready." Her flight engineer. "Godspeed. Systems are yours." Miller, her co-pilot, simply nodded, his hands moving to brace for impact. And finally, Thorne. "Copy, Valkyrie. The Punishers are ready to deploy. See you on the ground." With a final, resolute nod, Eva aimed the nose of the C-130 at the pass. She didn't come in for a straight landing. She came in at an angle, flying low and slow, bleeding off the last of her airspeed. At the last possible second, she kicked the rudder hard left. The massive aircraft, 100 feet long with a 132-foot wingspan, slewed sideways. The left wingtip dug into the mountainside, shearing off with a terrible screech of metal. The fuselage slammed into the ground, skidding sideways in a deafening, grinding slide of dirt and rock and tortured steel. It was a controlled, calculated crash of unimaginable violence. And it was perfect. The broken body of the Hercules came to rest directly in the center of the pass, a massive, impassable iron barricade. The Ghost's convoy, just entering the pass, screeched to a halt. The drivers stared in stunned disbelief at the wreckage that had literally fallen from the sky to block their escape. Before they could react, the rear ramp of the C-130 slammed down, and SEAL Team 3 poured out, a wave of disciplined violence. The ambush was brutal and swift. Caught in the open with no cover, the Ghost's men stood no chance. Within minutes, the firefight was over. Thorne himself pulled the stunned and furious Ghost from his armored vehicle, securing the HVT. The mission was complete as the dust settled. Eva, Miller, and the rest of her crew emerged from a shattered cockpit. They were bruised, battered, but miraculously alive. They stood together on the crumpled wing of their dead aircraft, watching as the SEALs secured the prisoners. The immediate danger was over. They had won. An impossible victory, bought at a terrible price. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows down the mountain pass. Eva looked at the faces of her crew, then at the SEALs. They had done it. A sense of profound, exhausted peace settled over her. She had not only saved Thorne's team and completed the mission, she had honored her father's memory in a way that no hearing or appeal ever could. She had proven that the name Rostova stood not for failure, but for sacrifice and victory. They stood their ground, on the wing of a broken plane, having given everything they had. If you believe in that kind of courage, in standing your ground no matter the cost, then hit that like button. And if there's a story of heroism you think we should tell next, let us know in the comments. We are always looking for the next great story to share. Their victory, however, was a lonely one. They were alive, and the HVT was captured, but they were stranded hundreds of miles deep in enemy territory. They had no aircraft, limited ammunition, and no way to call for rescue. They were an island in a sea of enemies. As they began to take stock of their situation, a new sound drifted on the morning breeze. The distant, rhythmic whomp 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 of approaching helicopters. Thorne immediately barked orders, getting his men into a defensive perimeter around the wreckage. Get ready. It could be a counterattack. Everyone grabbed a weapon, their brief moment of relief evaporating into a new, sharp tension. Eva squinted at the horizon. Multiple aircraft were approaching, flying fast and low, using the terrain for cover. They were dark, menacing shapes against the rising sun. But were they friend or foe? As they grew closer, their profiles became clear. They weren't American Black Hawks or Chinooks. They were Russian-made Mi-24 Hinds, flying tanks, the kind used by the Ghost's own mercenary forces. Hope died in Eva's chest, replaced by the cold, hard certainty that they had survived one impossible fight only to die in the next. The menacing silhouettes of the Hind gunships grew larger, their rotor wash kicking up dust and debris around the crashed C-130. The SEALs took cover behind the mangled fuselage, weapons raised, ready to sell their lives dearly. Thorne had his sights on the lead helicopter, his finger resting on the trigger. Eva and her flight crew, armed with pistols and a single rifle salvaged from the wreck, crouched behind a piece of the sheared-off wing. The air was thick with a grim acceptance of a last stand. This was it. After everything they had been through, this was how it would end. But the helicopters didn't fire. Their rocket pods remained silent, their chin-mounted cannons pointed downward. The lead Hind, instead of unleashing a torrent of fire, flared for a landing, settling into the dust 100 yards from the crash site. The side door slid open. The men of SEAL Team 3 tensed, expecting a flood of enemy soldiers. Instead, a single figure in a crisp, unfamiliar uniform stepped out, followed by a man they did recognize, a U.S. Air Force colonel. The colonel was a man named Hayes, a career officer with a reputation for being a rigid, by-the-book commander. He was also, as Eva knew with a cold knot in her stomach, the man who had presided over the final review of her father's service record, the review that had sealed his fate. Hayes's eyes took in the scene, the smoldering wreckage of the multi-million-dollar aircraft, the captured HVT being guarded by the SEALs, and the small, defiant group of Air Force personnel standing amid the chaos. His gaze finally settled on Eva, and his expression was unreadable, as hard and unforgiving as the mountain rock around them. He strode toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. Thorne moved to intercept him, but the colonel held up a hand. He stopped directly in front of Eva, his shadow falling over her. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. My orders were to secure the high-value target. Your orders were to provide transport and support. You were explicitly ordered to disengage. Instead, you flew into a kill zone, ignored direct commands from a superior officer on the ground, and deliberately destroyed a $60 million United States Air Force asset. You're facing a general court-martial for this. The words hit her like a physical blow. After everything, this was the response. Not relief, not praise. An accusation. A threat. Before she could even form a reply, Thorne stepped forward, placing himself between her and the colonel. "Sir," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "With all due respect, if Captain Rostova goes to a court-martial, it will be with the entire, unabridged testimony of SEAL Team 3. She didn't destroy an asset. She used it as a weapon to save my men and complete a mission that was, for all intents and purposes, a catastrophic failure. She did what no one else could. If anyone is held accountable for what happened here, it should be me. The intel was bad. I led my men into a trap." Behind him, the rest of the SEALs rose from their defensive positions, a silent, formidable wall of support. They stood with their commander, their loyalty to the pilot who had saved them absolute. Colonel Hayes looked from Thorne to the unwavering faces of the SEALs, and then back to Eva. For a long moment, he said nothing. He had received her last, desperate broadcast before the crash, a clipped, professional report stating her intention to block the pass, followed by her coordinates. He had diverted every friendly asset in the entire country, including the Allied nations Heinz, to race to that location, expecting to find nothing but bodies. Instead, he had found a victory. He finally broke the silence, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. He held up a small, ruggedized tablet. "While you were pulling your unconventional maneuver, Captain, the data analysts back at Bagram were pulling everything they could from the intel we seized in the initial raid. That intel included access to the Ghost's encrypted financial records." He tapped the screen, and a file appeared. It was an old investigation report. Eva recognized the case number instantly. It was her father's. "The Ghost has been on our radar for over a decade," Hayes continued, his eyes fixed on Eva. "He specializes in selling not just weapons, but information. For years, he's had a source inside the Allied command structure, feeding us faulty intelligence. We could never prove it. Until now." He zoomed in on a series of decade-old financial transfers. "These payments, from the Ghost Shell corporations, coincide exactly with the timeline of your father's last mission. The order he received, the one that forced him to make a safe choice and break off pursuit of his target, was based on a false threat, a phantom enemy squadron, reported by a compromised source. The same source network you dismantled by capturing the Ghost today." The world seemed to tilt under Eva's feet. All these years, her father had carried the weight of a failure that wasn't his. He had been a scapegoat, the victim of an enemy's lie. He hadn't been a coward. He had been betrayed. "Your father was innocent, Captain," Hayes said, his voice now quiet, tinged with something that sounded like regret. "He made the right call based on the information he had. Bad information. By capturing the Ghost, you didn't just finish your mission. You found the evidence that clears your father's name, once and for all." In front of her, in front of Thorne and the SEALs, Colonel Hayes tapped a button on his tablet. The screen displayed a draft of a court-martial recommendation against Captain Eva Rostova. He held her gaze for a second, then pressed delete. The file vanished. "Your father was a good man, Captain," he said. "A damned good pilot. He would be proud of you." He then turned to Thorne. "Commander, what is her call sign?" Thorne, who had stood in stunned silence listening to the revelation, looked at Eva. A slow smile spread across his face, cracking the grime and fatigue. "It was Valkyrie, sir," he said. "But I don't think that's right anymore." He turned to face Eva fully, the rest of his team watching, their faces filled with a respect that transcended rank or service branch. "Valkyrie's from. The myths just chose who lived and died. You did more than that. You chose how to win. You showed us the way." He snapped to attention, his posture perfect despite his exhaustion, and rendered her a sharp, perfect salute. "Captain Rostova, on behalf of my team, thank you." One by one, the battle-hardened operators of SEAL Team 3 followed their commander's lead, each man saluting the Air Force pilot they had once dismissed as a taxi driver weeks later. The dust of the mountains had been replaced by the polished floors and starched uniforms of a formal ceremony at Ramstein Air Base. Eva stood at attention, her crew and a recovered Lieutenant Miller standing proudly beside her. The general pinned the Air Force Cross, the second highest award for valor, above the name Rostova on her uniform. In the audience, cleaned up and in their dress uniforms, were Thorne and his entire team. After the medals were awarded, the presiding general made a final announcement. In recognition of the innovative tactics and incredible bravery displayed during Operation Ghost Trap, the Air Force is proud to announce the acceleration of a new variant of the C-130, specifically designed for special operations and rapid, unconventional extractions in hostile territory. This new aircraft will be designated the C-130V. A murmur went through the crowd. The general smiled. The V in this designation does not stand for a technical specification. It stands for Valkyrie. A new name for a new kind of warfighting, inspired by a new generation of heroes. Eva looked out at the crowd, her eyes finding Thorne's. He gave her a slow, respectful nod, a gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Her father's name was cleared. His honor was restored. But standing there, with a medal on, her chest and a legacy forged in fire and courage, she knew this was no longer just about him. Her own legacy had just begun. As the applause echoed through the hall, she allowed herself a small, determined smile. The final image was not of the medal, nor of the crowd, but of her gaze, steady and clear, looking toward the sky, no longer weighed down by the past, but ready for the future.